of the soon medical. Only they, as faithful ones, have to endure that. No other faithful one class endures that, except for the soon medical who become faithful ones. They and they alone have to endure the reign of the beast as Satan, both ruling, and the wrath of the Lamb unleashed. Brr. Unbelievable. And it shows their mindset with these three Hebrew children. They're not caring about their lives. They're not caring and thinking about the fleshy, mental, emotional, physical things around them. All they care about, they're spiritually, they're so locked in spiritually. It's unreal. It's just so, wow. Just, wow. Wow. You don't see them going, just a minute, I got to hang now. No. I'm going to tie my shoe. You don't, they did. They don't care. There's no regard for anything. They're just so locked in spiritually. They're so locked in. Verse 20. And he commanded to the most mighty men. That means he had these men of valor that were in the army to bind them. I think these mighty men of valor speak to how the demonic presence in the second half of tribulation is going to be buffeting and usurping and continually trying to make it hard for the people in the second half of tribulation to live and exist, not to mention the soon medical. His mighty men of valor. Okay. All right. Supposed to intimidate me? Mighty men of valor. In other words, he didn't want anybody who's a coward, but he also wanted somebody who was also rough and tough and of the upper ranks to make Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah to realize, oh, I'm livid, and I'm making sure that the best of my men shove you in that thing. And he says to bind them. Bind them? What's that about? Just so you know, bind them is the typology of when we're in the second half of tribulation. They're bound. They're under the wrath of the Lamb. They can't change it. Well, God wouldn't endure the bride to the wrath of God. Well, they're not the bride yet, but they are going to become faithful ones. But unfortunately, they're bound to have to go through the whole thing. They can't get out. There's no out. You got to go through the whole thing. You're bound to it. But literally what to speak to? They bound their hands. And like in slavery days, which is where the whole disgusting history of our country and other countries comes from in slavery, they would put a rope around the neck and tie their neck to their necks with their hands tied together. They have a rope from here to their hands and the hand to the next neck. So they were being ushered in like this, like a rope around their neck to their hand to the other person's neck, being ushered in like this. They're bound. That's how they were bound. That's the Babylonian way. That's how they did it. It wasn't the white supremacy racist way. They just copied what was all along the Babylonian Assyrian way. That's how they did it, right? They bound them like this. And by the way, it says shackle, but the thing is, it could be a shackle because it did mention that in Jeremiah that they put Zedekiah in brass fetters or shackles. The problem is that the word later on says that they were loosed, unloosed. And it means to untie or unbind. So could it mean that it came loose? Or could it mean it was string and it unbound? I don't know, but I tell you this. What's interesting is in verse 20, whether it's rope or whether it's actual brass fetters around their arms and around their necks, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. If it was brass, by the way, that makes it more ridiculous because that would have obviously brass gets hotter in fire, and that would have left a different burn around their neck and around their arms. Does it not? Get real. The rope is burned off. So it leads you to believe potentially it may have been the brass fetters. So if that's the case, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they're cast in the fiery furnace. Verse 21, the mighty men were bound. And now watch this now. With their coats, with their undergarments, with their hats, and with their other robes. And this speaks to the helmet, the loin, the chainmail, and the breastplate, which is part of the armor of God. Because remember, the chainmail is the undergarment below the breast, underneath the breastplate, that is ideally representing those who are the armies of the seasoned soldiers who were known as the Principes, P-R-I-N-C-I-P-E-S, the Principes in the Roman army. They were the seasoned soldiers, and they had the under chainmail underneath their breastplate, which is a sign of those who are deeper, long in the tooth in their faith. This is the undergarments he mentions, or the hosen. The helmet is the hat, the salvation of the soul. The actual loins girded, there's your other garments. And then you have, that's the undergarment, the loins, and the garments are the chainmail. Then the hat and the coats. So you have this breastplate, loins, chainmail, helmet being mentioned, which also, interesting enough, there's more parts of the armor of God than this, but why only 4 mentioned? Which I think speaks of the 4 fruit yields, the 100-fold, the 30, the 60, 100, right? They were the full complement of where they were at. They had fully matured in their faith. And here you have them bound and clothed, and it says that they were cast into the midst of the burning fire. And verse 22, it says, and therefore, because the king's command was urgent. Interesting, because that same urgent is the same thing Daniel said in chapter 2, verse 15. Why the harsh decree? Why the abusive harsh decree? In verse 22, it's letting you know the king's utterance was urgent, meaning he was speaking it like he was just like spitting out of his mouth. He's so vehemently angry. It speaks to the harsh, abusive tone of his command. Cast him in now! Cast him in now! Put him in now! He wasn't like, cast him in. That's not what he was. No. He did not go, continue, cast him in. No. The way verse 22 is worded, the king's utterance was severe. That means he was like spitting with anger. Cast him in! Kill him now! He was livid with fury. The last thing the Hebrew children thought they were going to see was that. Why is that important to know? It's exactly what Satan's going to do in the last half of tribulation, isn't it? The last half, when he is unleashed as the beast, as Satan incarnate, he's going to just be so angry. God's wrath of the Lamb also unleashed on us on the earth, as well as Satan unleashed. It's going to have people just be the last thing they're going to see. To stand for righteousness, stand for what's right, you're going to have to face that. It's not going to be easy. Don't lie to yourself. It'll be easy to live for Jesus. Stop lying to yourself. You have to face the emotional and mental and the whole spiritual trial of abuse that you have to stand in front of. That type of vitriol, that type of animus. Can you do it? Standing for your convictions and standing for and resolve with the sense that they did is one thing, but to do it in front of that visual, symbolic reality by the one who has the authority to do anything he wants, to abuse and take your life, that's quite another thing. That's quite another thing. And that's what's being asked of people who did give their lives in tribulation, the second half. It's being asked of them. To not just do it, oh yes, I will stand in line to give my life for Jesus. Is this the line? Is this the line? Oh yes, Jesus loves me, this I know. No, doofus, that's not how it's going to work. You're going to be in front of demonic presences. You're in front of Satan himself. He's going to adamantly, demonstratively display this hate and animus towards you. And you have to just control your emotions and your mental state and your spiritual conviction and resolution and say, still, I live for God. I give my life for Jesus. It's not going to be easy. Don't lie to yourself. Oh, it's going to be easy. No, it ain't. Just so you know. So, not to mention you have the 7 times hotter you're going into as well. Then it says in verse 22, the furnace was exceedingly hot, which was the word for extraordinarily. Extraordinarily. Beyond rational comprehension hot. And the flame of the fire slew the men who took up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Meaning, they opened the door, and the flame went, and they just got consumed. The scene is insane. It's so hot. When they opened the door, probably those little metal things they used to open it up, those little metal prongs, they probably, and it caught them. So why did they consume Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah? Why weren't they consumed? Well, what's with that? That right away was the tip of the hat. Like, did you see that they didn't get hurt? And the mighty men, the strong men, they got just consumed like that. It just killed them instantly. So verse 23, and these 3 mighty men, I think that verse 22 speaks to how Jesus is going to come back in Armageddon and say, do you see how I spare my faithful ones on Mount Zion, but the rest of you that are in front of me, how I pummel you? Yeah, I ain't playing. I will slay you. I always tell people, when Jesus comes back in Armageddon, you want to be behind him, because if you're in front of him, nothing good happens to you. Nothing. Unless you're at the Bema seat, when it's the culmination of that, then we'll see what happens there. But leading up to the Bema seat, when you're in front of him, nothing but bad happens to you. You do not want to be in front of him. And they were in front of the gate, and they got taken out like that. Our God's a consuming fire, it says. This isn't funny. This is God saying, you're done. So in verse 23, certain people can face this fiery consuming God, and don't worry, others, they don't live to stand. In verse 23, and these mighty men, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, fell down, bound, in the midst of the fiery furnace. So see the scene? The fire comes out, and they get consumed. And immediately they're walking in, this chain, this possibly bronze fetter around their neck and hand and arms, and then to the next guy's neck. And so they walk in, they fall down to their knees right away. They don't get killed, but they fall down right away, which means what? They saw Jesus, a Christophany, right away, right away, right away. They saw him right away. Well, how do I know? Because they fell down right away. Why are they falling down for him? Because he's in there. He didn't appear later on. He was there all the time. He was there to greet them as soon as they walked into that bad boy. He was right there. He's right there. They fell down as they were bound in the midst of the burning fiery furnace. Then Nebuchadnezzar, I love it, the Septuagint says, the King James misses this. The Septuagint says, he heard them singing praises. And verse 24, they were going, oh God is the mighty God who reigns. And he's like, what the? Do I hear songs? Do you see the mockery that God said, oh, mock me, do you? You're going to do songs with music, and then you're going to fall down and worship? I'm going to have them fall down and worship me, and then they're going to sing songs. Because I'm the one that teaches you praise. And then I was like, oh, that's insane. I'm hearing music, I'm hearing song, I'm hearing praise come from the furnace. I'm supposed to hear screeches and yells. No, he's hearing, our God is an awesome God who reigns. They're like, what the? He's like, are you kidding me right now? Where's the screams for help? Where's the agony of pain? Of the skin falling off your flesh, off your bones, your flesh just melting off. Nebuchadnezzar says he was amazed. He was astonished. He was, the word in the Hebrew means he was startled, like he just was looking at it. Like he was so filled with animus. He's like, what was that? He's like, what? I hear a song? Are they singing? Are they singing? What is going on? That's the scene. He's like beside himself. He's just waiting to get their destruction, and the opposite happens. The startledness of it all. I can just see his like, what? Then it says he rose up in alarm, and he spoke and said to his counselors, which are the Chaldeans, that did we not hurl 3 men bound in the midst of the fire? And they answered him and said, truly, meaning without a doubt, there was three people, and they were bound. There was 3, and we bound them by a hand over the neck. We threw them in. We know. We saw it. We was there. We with you, man. And he said, well, behold, in verse 25, I see 4, and they're loose, and they're walking around, and they have no damage. And not to mention, and I hear them singing. Can someone explain to me what's going on? You can see, he's just like, he's beside himself. I love it. It's God's way of saying, yeah, how about that? How about that? How about that? He's like, what? How? How? By the way, same phrasing used that they were not hurt is the same phrasing used later on, Daniel 6, about Daniel in the lion's den, when it says, when Darius came there, and he found that he wasn't injured at all. No hurt, no damage, not one scratch. And it says in verse 25, and not only are they singing, not only are they loosed, not only are they walking, not only are they not damaged, but on top of that, I see a 4th person walking around like the Son of God. Well, wait a minute. He looks like Son of God. Wait a minute. So you're telling me the 4th visage you saw looked differently. So that's why they said like he said like son of one of the gods. They didn't know that was another person. They knew that other visage, that other person they saw was not a human. Because they said, he looks like, the 4th person, the 4th looks like, which means he resembles the Son of the gods. Which means there was something physically about him which speaks to Jesus when he comes back, Well, he is going to throw down on people. You're going to, well, I wonder who Jesus is on the white horse. And see, how are you going to know from the tribulation white horse or the Antichrist versus him? Because you're going to know with the diadem, like circling on his head, there's a bunch of them, plus the big sword, the white horse, and the robe with dipped in blood and the name. You got to know it's him. And all the horses behind him, all the other faithful ones and mature ones and called ones are going to be behind him going, you're going to know it's him. You're going to know. You'll know. There ain't no regular white horse. There ain't no regular person on the white horse. You're going to know it's him. You're going to know. So here they're like, dude, something ain't right. He don't look like a regular person, right? How would the king know what he looked like? He wouldn't know. That's the whole point. The whole point is he saw something that was abnormal. And this is where I think, personally, I think Jesus was shining white, glorious, like he did in Mount Transfiguration. He was shining white, glorious to the eye of the person on the outside of the fire. And he saw the other three people in there, but he saw this white, glorious, like that doesn't make any sense. Something about Jesus' appearance was different. I don't know what it was, but it was different enough to know it goes against physics. It goes against normal reactions of the combination of cloth and flesh and fire. You don't have that reaction. That what I just saw is not normal. I think he saw a bright white light. That's what I think. I don't know that. I know one thing. He saw something that was distinctly different than what was normal for that to happen when you burn a person or a thing. You don't see that. He saw something different that it defied science, it defied experience, it defied what he was, that doesn't make any sense. He looked different. And so here he says, Nebuchadnezzar in verse 26, Nebuchadnezzar, as we end up this chapter, Nebuchadnezzar came near the mouth, which is again about 20 feet away, the fiery furnace, and he said, he's shouting out 20 feet away. It's like, he's shouting out, Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego, come forth from the midst of the fire. You servants of the Most High God, come forth, come hither. His whole tone has changed. His whole tone has changed. It's almost like there's a song by George Jones, and he's dead now. He's of a whole group called the Cathedrals. He sung a song about a guy who was an abusive father, and he said, when I went back to the home I was raised in, by a father abusing his kid, and he said, well, son, I've been changed. You got a new daddy now. And he said, thanks to Calvary, I don't live there anymore. So it reminds me of this story about Nebuchadnezzar went from being this angry, filled with furious person. He just got changed by God. God just changed his life. He just changed him. He just was overwhelmed with this scene. He's just overwhelmed. All this anger and fury went to, but thanks to God, he just all got, come out, Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego, come hither. He just changed his whole demeanor from this violent, abusive man to this welcoming, come out of the fire. It's an amazing image that God is showing you, that he said, you of the Most High God. And then he said in verse 27, and the princes and the governors and the captains and the king's counselors. Notice there's no judges, no lawyers, no sheriffs, no treasurers, and no rulers. Only 4 of the 8 people were here. Showing you again, it's a difference, but the earlier was a groundbreaking ceremony. They were the extracurricular people of his cabinet. Here, the main cabinet members, which are the princes, the governors, captains, and the counselors. They were here. And they being gathered together, he saw these men, upon whose bodies the fire had no power. That means that they were representing their soulical bodies. Once you get that soulical body, you don't lose it. The fire had no power. And it says, and their hair on their head, not one was singed. It refers to there's no loss of rewards. Not one hair of the body was singed. Not one hair on their head or on their arms. There's nothing. Not even singed. Are you kidding me? There's 2,800 degrees potentially, and not one thing was singed. Your body wasn't hurt, and the coats weren't changed. It means they weren't damaged. Their coats weren't damaged, which means that they had no blemish, no spot. They went through tribulation unstained by the odors and demonic influence and rule of Satan and the beast. Didn't change them whatsoever. Under the worst possible conditions, to Jesus' words in Luke 21, they went through it and smelling like a rose. And the last part, speaking of that, nor the smell of fire had passed on them. Meaning, again, they had no negative outcome whatsoever. Nothing. Nothing mentally, emotionally, nothing spiritually, nothing fazed them, nothing touched them. It speaks to their, again, protective stance that God has on the assumed medical and typology in tribulation, as it was on Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah had their sense of solical body guaranteed. They had no loss of rewards. They kept their garments unspotted, unblemished. And they had no smell of smoke, no negative consequence whatsoever. Nothing of the outside world or Satan's influences and attempts, nothing had an effect on them. Nothing. Not even the smell of it. Then he ends up by saying to you in verse 28 through 30, Nebuchadnezzar, he spoke and he said, "Blessed be that God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who have sent his angel and delivered his servants." Well, in Genesis 48:16, he mentions the angel, and it's referencing clearly a Christophany of Jesus when he says it this way, when Jacob is talking to Joseph about Manasseh and Ephraim. He says in verse 15 and 16, "He blessed Joseph and said, God, before whom my fathers Abraham and Isaac did walk, the God which tended me all my life long to this day, the angel which redeemed me from all evil, bless the lads." The angel that redeemed, no angel of God, no regular angel redeems you from evil. That's a reference to the angel of the Lord, Jesus himself. That's what he's talking about right here in chapter 3 and verse 28. He sent his angel. This is a Christophany of Jesus, the angel of the Lord. Remember that phrasing, the angel of the Lord, is the chief messenger of God, is Jesus himself, God incarnate. And delivered his servants that trusted, which means they ongoingly, it's in this constant tense of trusted in him, and have changed the king's words and yielded their bodies. The word change means he altered. He altered the king's words. When did he do that? When the king saw them, he heard them singing, he saw the fourth man, he saw they weren't damaged. He goes back to the other verse, when you saw that in verse 25, they were loose, they were walking, they weren't hurt. He saw the fourth man, before they heard him singing. All of that changed his furious, angry, violent, insolent, wrathful tone, just abusive, wanting to pummel him on the head. Went from that to this docile, wonderful, come. He changed. It tells you that. I'm not making that up. You say, oh, you're making that, you're being theatrical. The Bible says that the king was altered in his words. His whole demeanor changed. He went from a vile, violent, filled with fury, anger. I don't know, again, you have to understand, you have to appreciate what this means. Unless you're raised abusive, you don't understand you can't appreciate the full magnitude of it. To go from that level of DEFCON 1 to just like that, to be all docile and welcoming, I'm telling you, that's not normal. It's just not normal. It's just not. And it says he was altered, and they yielded their bodies, that they might not serve nor worship to any God except their own God. In verse 29 and 30, by the way, don't forget, in verse 12 it says, we will not serve or worship your God. In verse 14 they said, they won't serve and worship to God. In verse 18 they said it again, we're not going to serve and worship to God. And what does Nebuchadnezzar say in verse 28? That you will not, that you might not serve nor worship any other God except your own God. He finally it took him 3 times to learn the lesson. They told him 3 times, ain't gonna do it. Then he finally gives in to the statement and says, you're not going to worship any other, serve or worship any other God but your own. And in verse 29, therefore I set a decree that every person, every nation, every tongue, language, which speak anything amiss against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, which is again Hananiah, Mishael, Azaziah, shall be cut into pieces, and their houses made a dunghill. The same thing he said about the wise men in his council 16 years earlier, when they were given the Yahoo runaround, the Chaldeans. That was his decree with fury and anger to dismember them and then burn their houses on fire. So 16 years later, he says the same thing again about anybody speaking against the God of Hananiah, Mishael, Azariah. He's like, wow. Then in verse 29, he ends by saying, because there is no other God who can rescue, who can deliver after this sort, which means it's a way in Hebrew, it's in English, the best way to say it, I've never seen anything like this. There's nothing like this I've ever seen before. This goes beyond comprehension and understanding and plausible explanations. You don't understand what I just saw and witnessed. It is beyond explanation. It defies anything and everything we know that must be of God himself. That's what he's saying. So he's saying at this time, not because of both times now, Nebuchadnezzar is responding to God because of what he sees in a sign and wonder. He saw Daniel tell him a dream that he forgot himself and tell him what it meant. And it also made him feel good about himself. So much so, 16 years later, he got filled with himself. He's still in himself, made an image. Lost himself in what God originally taught him. Now God taught him again to another sign and a wonder. And he also acclimates to that sign and wonder like he did the first time. The only way you can know this is God must have told you. Now he's saying the only way I can explain that your God must be the only God there is, because what I just saw it defies belief. It defies anything I've ever seen before. There's no other sort like this who could deliver like what I just saw was ridiculous, what I just witnessed. Then in verse 30, the king promoted, which means he blessed in addition to what they already had. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and the province. So it means they weren't just over the affairs and works. The word promoted means he prospered them. It's the same phrasing if you go back to in Daniel 6:28. It's also used. We're going to go there in the future after he's restored from the lion's den. So Daniel also prospered in the reign. It doesn't mean promoted. It means that he had additional blessings, additional privileges, additional benefits that the king bestowed upon him. This is what happened to these three men. It speaks to how when you stand by faith, when you have the conviction, when you have the resolve, God will give you these awesome realities of how you have different benefits and blessings from him. So then in verse 28 it says his angel, that's referring to the Christophany, yeah. Interesting, in verse 25 it says the fourth like the son of some God. Yep. In the King James it says like the Son of God. Correct. But in the word God, in the actual the son of the sons of one, it's actually having the phrasing of one of the sons of God. That's why they phrase it that way in the Septuagint. It's a better translation. And then those are three different names. Yeah. So so the whole thing about this chapter you see here, you can see as we end the chapter there in verse 30, going into chapter 4 now, you can see how chapter 2 and 3 are both earmarks of chapter 2. Let's see the faithful one status of why Daniel is faithful and why he's looked at for who he is and how God alone gifted him. Look how he handled conflict. Look how he stood up with resolve and tenacity and conviction. And let's look 16 years after that, how he blazed a trail of testimony, of witness, and of laying down that light and salt of the earth, how to be that way, in which his other three friends, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, now followed in line with that. And now we see them fully 16 years later coming to their own maturity of their faith, and we see it demonstratively being exhibited in front of Nebuchadnezzar. That's what we see from a spiritual standpoint of takeaway for us on the good side. On the bad side, we see, God can work demonstrably in our lives and convict us in the person of Nebuchadnezzar and show us his sovereign will in our life, despite what we think, what we do. And if we don't meditate on what he's done, and we don't remember the lessons learned, and we don't foster and gravitate toward developing and cultivating the lessons he's taught us, we're going to doom to repeat it. And not only that, you're going to go off the rails and get consumed with yourself like Nebuchadnezzar did, and 16 years later misinterpret the dream that he was given by then building an image of the very dream you saw. Are you kidding me? It's the very opposite of what you know is true. That wasn't the intent of the dream, for you to be stuck on yourself. It was to give honor to God. He told you. Oh my gosh. Then you start putting mandates out to worship. It's so stupid. It just shows you how we lose our way when we don't focus and meditate and contemplate and reflect on who God is and what he's done in our life, what his word has to say. It took 16 years, a long time. But it did happen. When Nebuchadnezzar went so off the rails, he went to false idol worship of himself and demanding it. But then we see God giving him a second chance. And again, changing his heart. Did it twice. He changed his attitude and demeanor and heart twice. Chapter 2, angry. God stilled him. Next morning, hear from Daniel, he's fine. Here, chapter 3, he's angry, he's furious. God changes him. He alters his words, it says. God is showing you his sovereignty and his hand. It goes beyond human comprehension, goes beyond mental frame and emotional acuity. People say, I don't have a high EQ. I have a low emotional quotient. I'm not good with people. Are you good with obeying God? That's all you have to be, man. Just do what God tells you to do. Let him take care of the people situations. You see? That's all. And some people get caught up in this stuff. High emotional quotient people It basically means that those who do well interact with other people, right? Take it up on social cues. But if you think about it, it doesn't matter if you're introverted or extroverted or whatever you are. If you have your functions about you, and you understand who God is and what His Word has to say, and you just focus on that, then you'll be fine in the emotional quotient. Circumspectly, like the skutha thuno, see yourself, understanding how you fit in the situation, where your responsibility is, and you'll respond, you'll act, you'll think, and you'll stand with conviction and resolve like you should. And the emotional quotient, how you deal with people, will come through God's will and wisdom and truth, trustworthiness in your life. That's the lessons to learn from Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, Azariah so far. So we're going to continue on chapter 4 when we actually get back. We're going to take a break, just so you know. So this Friday will be, actually we have to go out of town next week for a time away for family in Texas. So we'll be gone. So I'll continue this after we stop in prayer, but I wanted to just put that out there. So with that being said, we'll pick up on chapter 4 in a couple of weeks. When we return, I'll give you the dates on that in just a minute. So let's close in prayer. So Father, we thank you for this time, opportunity that we have to gather with you. Thank you so much for your love and your provision and your truth, and just the depth of appreciation for your word and how you intervene in our life and provide for us. Thank you for all you do in sustaining us and giving us all we need, what we need every day throughout our lives. Help us to take not just the knowledge of who you are, but to vet ourselves to see the resolve, the conviction we need to have. Like these young men like Daniel at 16, or these older men now at 32, living with such tenacity, such resolve, such conviction, such filled with peace and yet firmness, of unwavering spirit, of just filled with just the anchored truth of who you are in their life, and they would not deviate. Nothing would sway them. Only you and you alone, where they were just really anchored and just trusting in you as their foundation, as their rock. Help us be like that. Help us to learn these lessons and how to interact and react and respond to people the right way, and to stand for you in the midst of any darkness, any trial, any persecution, any hardship, any evil, wickedness done unto us. Help us to not ever look at them as excuses or deflecting or whatever that may be, but always look inside ourselves as to what you expect from us, what you demand of us, and what we need to give to you in return for all you've given us. And we ask all this to help us. In Jesus, Yeshua's name we pray. Amen.